by Nathan Ruser, who's a researcher at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. And we're also hoping to be joined shortly by Zoon Ahmed Khan, who's a journalist and research fellow at the Belt and Road Strategy Institute at Tsinghua University in Beijing. But Nathan Ruser, good morning to you.
Hi, good morning.
Good morning.
Thanks for having me.
So your organisation recently produced a report stating that there were, I think, 380 suspected re-education facilities in Xinjiang, which was a lot more than previously thought. Could you, since we're talking about reliable information, could you tell us about your research procedures and where do you get your information from?
Yeah, so we've found about 381 facilities now, which is quite a high number. Basically, when you look at Xinjiang, it's this very much information black hole. No reliable, independent information can get in or out of Xinjiang. And that's why we resorted to looking at satellite imagery, which is something that sort of is objective, is reliable, and is sort of regularly updated. So what we did was we sort of used different primary source methodology, whether it was journalists visiting, Chinese state media reports, or construction tenders, to look at a good handful of camps. I think it was close to 100 camps that we had that primary evidence for. And using that, we built a very strong idea of what these facilities looked like, what the securitization looked like, what their architecture looked like, what their positioning looked like, and all of that. And then it was sort of just a matter of scouring satellite imagery, looking for facilities that fit exactly that bill of what these detention facilities that we know what they look like, and finding more that look exactly like that.
So how,
and we were actually aided...
But how sure can you be...
Sorry.
Please finish, yeah.
We were actually aided in that a lot by looking at sort of time series data. So you can see a facility that used to be a school has transformed entirely with new fences, watchtowers, and everything put up. And we also looked at night lights. So, for example, a lot of these facilities have been built out of the desert. So when we looked at the night sky in 2016, places that were dark now and that were dark in 2016 and are light now, a lot of those turned out to be camps when we looked at them in more detail, which matches with the timeline of the crackdown.
How sure can you be that analysis of satellite imagery can be that accurate?
We believe it's quite accurate. Basically, it's impossible to sort of know this for sure without independent access on the ground, which the Chinese government has so far refused to do. But we've built a very solid idea of what these camps look like, and every time that our research has been challenged by people that are unsure about a camp or unsure about our reasoning behind a camp, we've been able to explain it thoroughly, why these new security features show that it's an abnormal facility and why we believe that to be a camp. And often that has included that primary source evidence, such as journalists visiting, Chinese state media looking at it, and construction tenders, which sort of reference a legal education through transformation detention center or something.
It's quite difficult for journalists to visit the region. I mean, there have been journalists going in there, but again, I mean, how sort of accurate and how useful are the reports that come out of Xinjiang?
Yeah, so the access to Xinjiang, especially for journalists, is very tightly controlled. For example, I've known reporters being denied from accessing an entire county where we know that a prison is under construction there. But a lot of the times when you see these sort of, in many ways they're Potemkin tours that the Chinese government takes journalists and diplomats on through a few select camps. But although these are sanitized camps that they've said that they sort of misrepresent the human rights abuses happening within them, it can still sort of give you this data point that this is a camp. You can look through the historical imagery of what it looked like before journalists were able to visit it. And again, yeah, that helps build up that idea of what these camps look like from the air and how to differentiate them from other facilities such as government buildings, schools, or any other building that sort of a normal society will have.
Where do you get the satellite pictures? Who gives you those?
Honestly, you can access most of it through Google Earth. Google Earth has quite up-to-date satellite imagery of Xinjiang, but where that hasn't been sort of up to date enough. We've used other providers, and that's even included Chinese satellite providers.
How much can you really tell what's going on from Google Earth? I'm just thinking that, the talk of genocide, cultural genocide and concentration camps brings to mind, the Holocaust in essence, whereas the Chinese would maintain that what we're talking about here are re-education centres. They're centres in which people go, they are re-educated, and then they leave. They're not exterminated. They return to life, and they return with new skills. So you're completely mischaracterising what's going on actually inside these things, and you're only getting the most superficial idea by looking at it all on Google Maps.
Yeah, so we don't know as much as we'd like to, but it's very clear to look at from survivor testimony and victim testimony, and I think it's important to challenge your definition of genocide there, whereas it's not extermination. Genocide refers to a much wider thing, and of course we don't know enough about these camps from just looking from the sky, but when we can talk to victim testimony and you start to get an idea of what happens, and of course independent observers would be the ideal way to do this, but that's impossible at the moment. When you throw around the word cultural genocide, which I think is important because that possibly characterises what's happening in Xinjiang better. And although we can't look at that from the detention centres, what we have seen is a concerted effort to erase Uyghur culture and other non-Han nationalities. For example, about 2/3 of the mosques in Xinjiang, according to our analysis, largely driven from satellite imagery, have been demolished or damaged in the last 3 years. A solid 50 or 60% of the important cultural sites and significant shrines have been demolished, including one 20 kilometres out in the middle of the desert, where the Chinese government sent bulldozers in 20 kilometres through sand dunes to demolish and raze an entire sacred settlement that sat there for over 1,000 years. So, although it doesn't tell us everything that we'd like to know, it gives us an insight into what's actually happening on the ground in an area that has absolutely no reliable information coming in or out of it. So, of course, it is just one source of information, but at the moment it's the most reliable that we have. And I would love that to change in independent observers to be able to go in and see what's happening on the ground through the different lenses than just a satellite. But at the moment,
is it literally true?
Satellite imagery.
Okay, but is it literally true that people are going to these camps, being trained, receiving new skills, and then leaving?
That seems to be the case for some of the lower security facilities, but even those lower security facilities look nothing like a vocational training centre by any definition of the rest of the world. But what I think is more important is the higher security facilities, which are equally large, which are even larger and equal in number, that sort of seem to show no evidence of that re-education, but seem to just be for the removal of people from society, for ordinary acts of faith and identity.
Okay, also with us is Zoon Ahmed Khan, a journalist research fellow at the Belt and Road Strategic Strategy Institute at Tsinghua University. Good morning to you, and thank you very much for joining us.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
So, from the information that we can gather, and of course, as we've been discussing, it all seems very partial and hard to pick apart for various reasons. Maybe people are being re-educated in many of these camps, but to compare them to boarding schools maybe as unrealistic as to compare them to concentration camps. Are these places where people are forced to attend, or are these places where people are not allowed to leave?
Okay, I think firstly it's important for me to give a context why Xinjiang, or what's happening in Xinjiang, is quite relevant to where I come from. I'm from Pakistan, and actually we have experienced after in the 80s and also post 9/11, there was instability, there were developments in the region because of which we had to face a backlash of what could occur in the case that certain ideologies, certain mindsets are allowed to fester or happen to fester. So I do understand that for people who don't have this kind of context or who have never experienced within their countries separatism, terrorism, or extremism, would not understand why maybe sometimes countries need to make tough choices. So that said, what's happening in Xinjiang, of course, just like what's happening in Afghanistan, just like what's happening in Iraq, and just like what's happening even in my own country, in northern parts of Pakistan, in northwest of Pakistan, we can never know 100% what is happening on the ground. But the fact is that I do feel the narrative on Xinjiang is it's far-fetched. It is maybe wishful. Maybe the idea is not just to understand what China is facing or what are the reasons for China to introduce certain policies, but actually just to criticize. So that said, I don't want to really comment too much on why people have different perspectives on Xinjiang, but this is my point of view that, for example, when in the region, in Central Asia, in Afghanistan, and also in northern Pakistan, we have a problem of people being vulnerable and susceptible to ideas that are not conducive to society at large. And this has nothing to do with religion. It just has to do with the fact that we share a region, we share borders, and whatever is being experienced on one side of the border can be experienced on the other side of the border. So, for example, in Pakistan, if Afghanistan has some kind of instability or influence, Pakistan is also susceptible, and vice versa. So just like that, in Xinjiang, there was a problem of terrorism. There was a problem of instability. It was not safe. And actually, I think that what the government has done could potentially be a lasting solution. It's not a perfect solution, like no other solution. What happened in Afghanistan post 9/11 is also not definitely maybe far worse in terms of its implications on people's livelihoods. What happened in Iraq, we were just talking about Google Maps, and actually I remember what it was like when mushroom clouds were being talked about, and when supposedly certain weapons of mass destruction were being seen or monitored through these kind of satellite images as well. But the impact was 1 million people died just in the first 2 months of the war. So I think it is irresponsible sometimes to make these kind of far-fetched assumptions. I do think that whenever there has been a threat or a perception of maybe a group of people, a faction that could be harmful to the interests of society at large, then there are different choices that countries have made or governments have made.
Okay,
we can label them terrorists, and so this is something that
All right, Mr. Ruser?
Yeah, I think there's some damage in sort of looking at this through purely a counter-terrorism lens. For example, I'm from Australia, and since 2014, Australia has seen as many terrorist attacks or plots as Xinjiang has, but we're not introducing a detention regime that detains hundreds of thousands and quite likely up to 1 million people.
Yes.
And what you've seen this detention level for is not acts of terrorism or not ideas of terrorist sympathy, but ordinary actions of sort of faith and their identity and their culture. So it's impossible to sort of... I don't think it's legitimate to frame the internment and the detainment of hundreds of thousands up to 1 million people purely through the eyes of counter-terrorism, whereas unless you're arguing that a solid 10% of Uyghurs are actually terrorists, which is an absurd claim.
No.
And all the people that I know who have family detained... Sorry, may I please continue? All the people that I know who have had family detained in these camps, most of them have been sort of maths teachers or nurses. I don't know a single one that has had any terrorist sympathies.
Okay, Ms. Khan?
And
okay.
the idea that... Yeah, go on.
Yeah, go on. Ms. Khan?
Okay. So I do understand that maybe if what this number, I don't know what is the basis for this number, to be honest. But let me tell you what it feels like when a country is trying to fight terrorism. And I'll give you an example. For instance, it's impossible for people to target exactly who is influenced and how much. This is not even for any country like the United States, for Pakistan, for Afghanistan. It is impossible to say that, okay, you know what, I think, 10,000 people are terrorists, let's target them. Do you know that the CIA sanctioned drone strikes that happened in Pakistan for a long period? More than 90% of the people who died were plain civilians, and that's proven. So this is just an example of what happens when actually any group, any organization, or any ideology actually is able to go forward and harm or damage the society. So I'm not saying that we should agree with any policy that has to maybe hurt the interests of the people, but we don't have great choices to start with. So perhaps in Australia, maybe there were more incidents, and the approach is different. But in Xinjiang, I think I would make a comparison with what happened across the border, what happened in countries in the region. I think that would be more relevant when we give the example of Xinjiang. So that said, what I feel is that whatever the Chinese government is doing seems to be a sustainable solution, because it seems to provide opportunities for people who perhaps would be disillusioned or perhaps would think that resorting to these ideologies, these ideas that give them a sense of purpose, but actually they don't. Because I think coming from the region, I don't want to say that, okay, you're from Australia, so your context or your analysis is irrelevant to Xinjiang. But there is a regional context that does make sense.
Okay,
and I think
okay, Mr. Ruser?
Yeah, so I guess I would argue that this isn't so much a sustainable solution, but more a sort of lasting regime of detention to remove hundreds of thousands of people from society for any slight. We know that people have been detained for having WhatsApp on their phone. I've heard multiple accounts of people.
I mean, it has worked.
They didn't know why they were detained.
Okay, it has worked to the extent that there haven't been any more terrorist incidents.
It seems it's worked in the matter that blowing up a dam would destroy an anthill on the other side of the dam, but it would also destroy the entire village downstream of it. What you're doing is what Xinjiang is doing is similar to that in its scale, whereas it's a huge network and it's a huge regime of detention and I've heard from survivors, I've heard from witnesses multiple times that they were detained. They didn't know why they were detained, but they were told to pick their crime from a list. They were given a list of about 75 different crimes, and they were told to pick which one they did, and that's what they would be sentenced with. And that's from multiple corroborated witnesses. It's not just the satellite imagery. So I guess it's just, in my opinion, it's invalid to sort of have this massive regime of detention, which I would say is unparalleled in the region and unparalleled in history in recent times, for a problem of terrorism that seems quite... Terrorism is always serious, but I wouldn't say that the problem of terrorism in Xinjiang was anywhere near the problem of terrorism in Syria or ISIS. It's not fair to sort of compare it to ISIS. It's from my reading and from the reading of a lot of Uyghurs that I've talked to, a lot of it is more communal violence and issues of that rather than strict transnational terrorism, which is how a lot of Chinese narratives are trying to frame the problem.
Wasn't the purpose to head off a potential problem before it could develop?
Yes.
In heading off a problem by detaining hundreds of thousands to 1 million people for sort of anything that's seen as a slight against Communist Party ideology, it's sort of a solution to a very different problem. It's not a solution to terrorism, it's a solution to sort of any political free thought for people that are considered unloyal by their race, which is what Uyghurs and other non-Han nationalities are in Xinjiang.
Or vulnerable to extremist influence.
potentially, but certainly not in the scale that this detention regime showed.
Zoon Ahmed Khan, so the purposes of these facilities are, other than de-radicalisation, to teach people new skills. I mean, according to the central government, is there evidence that people have become more employable, have got better jobs, and so on?
Yesterday, for example, I was on a panel in Beijing, and we had a group of people from Urumqi. One of them was Tajik, one was Uyghur, and another was Han Chinese. And all three of them had chosen, after spending a few years of studying and working in other parts of China or abroad, they chose to settle in Urumqi. And this is a question that I asked them, exactly the question that you asked me. I haven't visited any of these re-education centers yet, but I know diplomats who have, journalists who have, and my question to them was exactly this. Are you safer? What is the impact?
But are they free? Are they free to speak their minds in a context like that, in a public discussion in Beijing? Can they really say anything? I mean, it's a pretty straightforward question. Can they say anything which contradicts the official line? Did they? Did anyone say anything that could contradict the official line in any way?
Actually, what they talked about was just their personal experience of why they chose to be in Urumqi. And this is what I'm going to talk about. Because the idea that people are not free to live their lives, to work, to pursue whatever they believe in, is a little false, it's a little exaggerated. Maybe they're not able to speak their minds 100%. But I will tell you that, no one, including myself, I don't express my mind 100%, no matter where I am. If I'm at work, if I'm speaking with you, the idea is to be appropriate in a certain context. So I do think what is happening in Xinjiang needs to be understood in the context of what could have happened, what was possible. And for that, I think the comparison with countries in the region is very important. People who have developed skills that could help them be more employable are less likely to resort to conform to extremist ideology. Giving an example of my own country, in Pakistan, we have regions, we have areas where people have been susceptible, people have been influenced. And the impact is that sometimes, the armies need to go in and actually kill many people, because it's possible that maybe more than 50% of this group of people is susceptible, is not conducive to the interests of society at large. And this is the choice that needs to be made if the issue festers. What China has done is try to understand what are the factors that make people disillusioned, that make people more likely to become part of these organizations or these ideas. And one of them is the lack of opportunities, instability, not having a way forward, not having something to look forward to. So I do think that maybe we still don't have a perfect solution to the problems that we are experiencing in society at large and in the region at large. But what China has done seems to be, is definitely much better in terms of how many lives we lose in that process. It really just boils down to that.